Hello and welcome. Thanks for attending this Daoist Foundation remote talk. My name is Komjathy. My primary Daoist name is Xiujing, Cultivating Stillness. With Kate Townsend, I'm the founding co-director and senior teacher of the Daoist Foundation, a nonprofit Daoist religious and educational organization dedicated to fostering authentic Daoist study and practice and to preserving and transmitting traditional Daoist culture. In the Daoist tradition, we refer to these types of meetings and talks as Lundao. Lundao literally means discussing the Tao, with the Tao being the sacred and ultimate concern of Daoists. It is a Daoist conversation about the Tao, Daoist practice realization, and/or the Daoist tradition. It may be a formal discourse, something akin to a Zen Buddhist Dharma talk, or a communal discussion. It may be an abbot's lecture, formal spiritual direction, and even drinking tea together. So it's any meeting between Daoists because we're always focusing on the Tao in some respect, remembering the sacred, maintaining sacred orientation. In our approach, Lundao usually includes both a formal talk and more open discussion. For this second set of talks, I want to discuss some more technical topics, especially relevant for members of the Daoist Foundation and the larger global Daoist community, whether from an adherent or scholarly perspective. So I'm going to share my screen with you. For this Lundao, I want to focus on the inner cultivation lineages of classical Daoism. This is the earliest Daoist religious community and the beginning of the Daoist tradition as such. These were loosely affiliated master-disciple communities, emphasizing apophatic and quietistic, that is, emptiness and stillness-based meditation and mystical union with the Tao. So in classical Daoism, we find the use of a self-referential term. This is largely overlooked in other kinds of discussions of the tradition. But in classical Daoism, Daoists refer to their own practices as Dao Shu, the techniques of the Tao. It's also translated as arts of the way, or way arts for short. When we look at this phrase, the first character is obviously Tao, the sacred and ultimate concern of Daoists, but then the second character is Shu, so techniques or methods or a certain kind of work or training. The etymology of this character consists of Xing, so practice or to move or to act, and that originally depicted a crossroads, but now it consists of Chi, left step, and Chu, right step, so that's the outer part of the character, and then the inner part of the character is Shu, art, craft, or skill. So what's interesting about this is it suggests that there were specific practices aimed at alignment, attunement, and realization of the Tao, and that's what members of the inner cultivation lineages of classical Daoism emphasized. So the earliest occurrences and the primary occurrences of this phrase Dao Shu, the techniques of the Tao or arts of the way, appears in the Zhuangzi in chapter 6 and chapter 33. So this is significant because chapter 6 is part of the inner chapters, so the earliest layers of the text. And chapter 33 is the culmination of the text, where you have a discussion of the larger kind of Daoist community and thinking about the Daoist tradition from a more kind of systematic and integrated way. So the first passage says, fish thrive in water, humans thrive in the Tao. For those who thrive in water, dig a pond and they will find nourishment enough. For those who thrive in the Tao, don't bother about them and their lives will be secure. So it is said, fish forget each other in rivers and lakes. Humans forget each other through the techniques of the Tao. And the second passage says, to regard the root as pure and things as coarse, to look upon accumulation as insufficiency, dwelling alone, tranquil and placid, in spiritual illumination. There were those in ancient times who held that the techniques of the Tao lay in these things. Past guardian Yin, Yin Shi, and Lao Dan, Lao Tzu, heard their currents and delighted in them. They established them through constant non-being and being, and mastered them through great unity. Gentle weakness and humble self-effacement are its outer marks, emptiness and non-injury of the myriad beings are its substance. So the Zhuangs of the Book of Master Zhuang is a very complicated text. It contains historical and textual layers dating from the 4th to the 2nd century BCE, and it also includes teachings of various Daoist elders associated with the inner cultivation lineages of classical Daoism. So having this title of the Zhuangs of the Book of Master Zhuang is slightly misleading because only parts of the text are actually written by or associated with Zhuangs or Zhuangzhou. In any case, the first passage is kind of showing us this parallel between fish and humans in relationship to water and the Tao. And specifically here, these Taoists are talking about the Tao Shu, the techniques of the Tao, as the means for returning to the Tao. So there are specific methods, and we'll get into this in a moment, but a certain form of meditation emphasizing emptiness and stillness as the means to connect with what's sacred or what's ultimately real. In the second passage, you have this systematization of earlier teachings and earlier figures in the Zhuangzi and the larger kind of classical Taoist tradition, this emerging movement, where they talk about the techniques of the Tao as the shared spiritual repertoire or training regimen. And then they kind of identify this as associated with Lao Tzu and Yin Shi. So these are legendary kind of mythological figures, but nonetheless an emerging sense of tradition. And again, emphasizing the Tao Shu, the techniques of the Tao. And what are they cultivating? They're cultivating stillness, they're cultivating spiritual illumination. They lead us to some kind of great unity or unification. And then interestingly, and you find this a lot in classical Taoism and then of course in the later tradition as well, the kind of relationship between the external and the internal. So there's some kind of internal cultivation that's leading to an external expression. So the internal is emptiness and non-injury of the myriad beings. This is the root of practice here, defined as the techniques of the Tao, and then expressed as gentle weakness and humble self-effacement. So these outer marks that you can recognize Taoists by. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about Taoism, and especially classical Taoism, this earliest form of Taoism, and then moving into the larger Taoist tradition, and what kinds of indigenous Chinese names are used for Taoism. So the two most commonly used are Daojia and Daojiao, and just so you know, the asterisks indicate terms that appear in classical Taoism itself. So I would suggest these are actual self-referential names, a kind of self-conscious community with an emerging sense of tradition and referring to itself this way. So Buyan Zhijiao, the teaching beyond or without words. Interesting, right? Because obviously it's being expressed through words. But the key here is that Taoism emphasizes this kind of energetic presence, this subtle transmission, the subtle reality of the Tao that can be cultivated and connected with. As I mentioned, Daojia and Daojiao are the two most commonly invoked names. Daojia is coming from around 100 BCE, and it literally means the family of the Tao. So this is sometimes misunderstood as something called philosophical Taoism, which is a fiction, and I'll get into that in a moment. And Daojiao appears later primarily to distinguish Taoism from Buddhism, literally the teachings of the Tao. So also with this sense of both doctrine, but also teachers. So you can see in Chinese, both just refer to the Tao. One wants us to think about the relationship of Taoists to the Tao as a kind of family, so a specific kind of ancestry or lineage or genealogy. And the second one wants us to think about a certain set of views, principles, like commitments, but also the fact that there are teachers involved. So Buyan Zhijiao comes from the period of classical Taoism, Daojia also from the period of classical Taoism, but later we were just looking at Tao Shu, the techniques of the Tao. So this is interesting, as I said before, because this is coming out of the Zhuangzi itself. So Taoists thinking about themselves as doing a certain set of practices. Dao Tong, the tradition of the Tao, and Dao Shui, the study of the Tao, are actually used later to refer to Ruism or so-called Confucianism. But here I want to do a kind of Taoist retrieval of these terms to say in a somewhat polemical way that Dao Tong and Dao Shui don't refer to Ruism, they refer to Daoism. So Ruism attempt to kind of appropriate the Dao and kind of misrepresent Ruism or Confucianism as the tradition or the study of the Dao, or way learning sometimes is the way that Dao Shui is interpreted. But Daoism is Dao Tong and Daoism is Dao Shui. In the modern world, sometimes Dao Shui is used in the sense of Daoist studies as well. Gu Dao, so the way of the ancients, or Guzhi Dao. Sometimes this is just translated as the ancient way or the ancient Dao. But there is a way to read this, and there's some other evidence to read it this way, as these are Daoist, referring to Daoism as this, the way of antiquity or the way of the ancients, the people that came before us that created this community and this lineage. Also, you find Shengren Dao, the way of the sages, as I think, a kind of emerging name for classical Daoism. This was especially strong in the Tao Te Ching. So chapter 81 of the Tao Te Ching ends with this, talks about the way of the sages, focuses on Wu Zheng, on non-contention or not contending. Also, Wu Wei Qingjing Dao, the way of non-action and clear stillness. So this is very central in early Chenjin and early complete perfection Taoism for how these Taoists talk about the Taoist tradition. And this is, of course, interesting because you can see Dao now is used in the sense of way. So Taoism as the way to the way, the small Tao that leads to the Tao in the ultimate sense. And these Taoists say, drawing upon classical Taoism, that Taoism really emphasizes these kinds of two primary practices or qualities, non-action and clear stillness. Qingjing is also translated as clarity and stillness, but here it's more of a composite phrase. Also, Xuan Feng, the mysterious movement. Feng literally means wind, so I also translate this as mysterious currents. And Xuan Men, the mysterious gate. So both of these phrases, Xuan, allude to chapter 1 of the Tao Te Ching, where Xuan is another name for the Tao. So the Tao as mystery. So Xuan invokes the Tao. So Taoism as the mysterious movement, a kind of energetic presence in the world, a kind of invoking or witnessing of that presence, and also Xuan Men, this gate to the mystery or this mysterious gate, the tradition that helps to orient one towards the Tao as mystery. In my way of thinking about Taoism, we have what are called the 7 periods and the 4 divisions, and I've also included here the key movements under the 4 divisions. So I'm not going to go through all this, I just want you to have a sense of like how we might map the Taoist tradition from a more revisionist interpretive perspective. And here we're talking about classical Taoism. So Taoism from the Warring States to the early Han Dynasty, so from around 350 BCE to around 90 BCE. And then the primary movement is what we're talking about today, the Inner Cultivation Lineages. They did not refer to themselves this way, right? This is a contemporary academic name used to designate them. So I'll get into that in a moment. But here you can see it's quite diverse. So the 7 periods are really asking us to think through Taoism in a historical way. What was happening in different periods of Chinese history, and especially dynastic history, which ends in 1912. Then looking at the 4 divisions is really saying we should also look at social organization. So what's happening in classical Taoism versus early organized Taoism, later organized Taoism, and so forth. So classical Taoism is really kind of loosely related master-disciple communities. Early organized Taoism starts to be the appearance of an actual organized tradition, starting to have more established kinds of institutions, but primarily a householder tradition, moving into later organized Taoism when you have the emergence and the kind of emphasis on more of a monastic system and so on. So they're householder and monastic traditions, but that's after classical Taoism. So classical Taoism looks primarily like a householder, quote unquote, movement, but with, you might say, ascetic or even renunciant tendencies, at the very least eremitic tendencies, meaning like there's a strong emphasis on seclusion and kind of internal cultivation. So Classical Daoism is meant to replace so-called philosophical Daoism, strike through, and organized Daoism is meant to replace so-called religious Daoism, strike through. This distinction is a modern fabrication, fiction, and fantasy. It's rooted in colonialist, missionary, and Orientalist views and legacies. It's falsely claimed to correspond to Daojia, what we were just looking at, literally the family of the Tao, which says nothing about philosophy, and Daojia, literally the teachings of the Tao, which says nothing about religion. The contextual meanings of these terms are actually quite complicated. They have nothing to do with this artificial distinction between so-called philosophical Taoism and so-called religious Taoism. Daojia literally was more of a way of talking about classical Taoism, and eventually it was actually adopted to refer to the Taoist tradition more generally, including the Taoist clergy and the larger Taoist community. Daojia was originally coined to distinguish Taoism from Buddhism, and as I mentioned, both of these are really emphasizing the Tao as the sacred and ultimate concern of Taoists. So fundamentally, it's theological. So if we want to make this kind of modern distinction or characterization, it's religious. It's not philosophical. So philosophical Taoism, even though there's some kind of more modern, you might say, scholars of Taoism emphasizing this, there's no evidence that Taoists thought of their tradition this way, and it's also a mischaracterization from an interpretive perspective. So now it's often accompanied by invincible ignorance and a conspiracy of ignorance. I've referred to this as the bifurcated view of Taoism or the Legian view of Taoism, this idea that there's some kind of pure original Taoism called philosophical Taoism and some kind of degenerate like institutional Taoism that's called religious Taoism. So there's no evidence for this. In fact, the texts, the historical context, the kind of analysis of the phenomenon point towards the fact that Taoism was a religious community from the beginning. But you still have scholars of so-called Chinese philosophy and now even so-called Taoist philosophy clinging to this idea. Also connoisseurs of Taoism. So this idea that, what I'm really interested in or what we're emphasizing is philosophical Taoism. So it's no coincidence that what you find repeatedly is the kind of unnecessary and really unjustified retranslation of texts like the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi. These are the only texts that are cited or analyzed by people clinging to these ideas. So it also fails to locate those texts in a larger kind of textual corpus and in the larger Taoist tradition. As I mentioned, I would want to shift more in the direction of talking about things like Dao Xue, the study of the Tao, and Dao Tong, the tradition of the Tao, as like larger umbrella names for Taoism, but this becomes quite complicated because a lot of the times these invoke Ruism or Confucianism, so it will create potential confusion. But my view of this is really a kind of lineal, what I refer to as a lineal or a continuity of tradition model. So LK is just the abbreviation for my name. So this is the way that I've kind of characterized it. So looking for connective strands throughout the Taoist tradition, right? The way in which classical Taoism and organized Taoism actually overlaps, the way in which organized Taoism is rooted in classical Taoism feeding into organized Taoism. And of course, there's a lot of diversity, there's a lot of differences, but there's also a lot of similarities. There's some kind of foundational views. There's a lot of influence. And so if we kind of start out with this idea of like a bifurcated or a truncated view of Taoism, we will get confused and we will kind of fail to understand the tradition. So shifting from these fictions of so-called philosophical Taoism, so-called religious Taoism into classical Taoism and organized Taoism, if you want some kind of simple framework, it's more neutral because it allows us to investigate the question of what are the defining characteristics of classical Taoism. Is it primarily philosophical? So the answer is no, but at least classical Taoism allows us to ask that question. Is it philosophical? Is it religious? Is it contemplative? Is it mystical? What are the defining characteristics of classical Taoism and organized Taoism, including the specific movements associated with this? So one of the things I've suggested to people who really do want to explore the philosophical dimensions of Taoism, and I'm not saying there aren't philosophical dimensions. What I'm saying is the idea of philosophical Taoism is a fiction. the idea of Daoist philosophy, quote unquote, is problematic because what most people mean by this is some kind of disembodied thought or intellectual rumination, which is the opposite of what classical Daoism emphasizes. So we can talk about something like contemplative philosophy via Pierre Hadot. Pierre Hadot is this French scholar of Western philosophy and emphasized spiritual exercises. And also the late Michel Foucault, this French philosopher, in his later work, he emphasizes techniques of self. So one of the reasons to kind of put this here is to say, even in the tradition of Western philosophy, there are revisionist or more radical views that say there's really a practice involved, and that practice aims at some kind of self-transformation. So if we want to shift in that direction, then we could potentially talk about something like Daoist contemplative philosophy, but this would radically challenge a lot of the assumptions of mainstream philosophy, including Western philosophical traditions. So we come to the religion question. Is Daoism a religion? So the answer is clearly yes. It's an indigenous Chinese religion and now global religion. But one of the questions that comes up is, well, was there some aspect of Daoism that wasn't religious, right? So that's where you get philosophical Daoism strike through. But in fact, classical Daoism is better characterized as religious. So one issue that comes up here is unsophisticated views of religion, religions, and religious, including conflation of religion, quote unquote, with institution. And unfortunately, very few scholars of Daoism have any actual training in religious studies, that is, the scholarly discipline dedicated to research and education on religion, specifically from a comparative, cross-cultural, and theoretical perspective. And this is quite strange, right? Because a lot of these people have appointments in departments of religious studies, but they have no actual training in religious studies and sometimes even less understanding of religion from a sophisticated perspective. So my views of Daoism is that Daoism was a religious community and an emerging religious tradition from the beginning, right? Here dated to the 4th century BCE. It was probably a little bit earlier than that, but the earliest evidence, textual evidence that we have is probably around 350 BCE. This is the Neye and maybe like layers of the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. And so when we talk about classical Daoism, right, even though there's an open question of what are its defining characteristics, to me, it's quite clearly religious. And this is why I think that. Drawing upon religious studies, I would say we can talk about things like hierophanies via Mircea Eliade, so the idea of manifestations of sacred realities, and also an ultimate concern via Paul Tillich. So classical Daoism and the Daoist tradition more generally is emphasizing a certain kind of cosmological and theological view centering on the Tao as sacred. And then when we look at those defining characteristics, which we'll do in a moment, it becomes even more clearly religious in the sense of about something ultimately real, something we can attune ourselves with, something that infuses the world, infuses human existence. We can also talk about this in terms of Clifford Geertz's idea of a symbol system. So this is one of the ways that Clifford Geertz understands and discusses religion. So a symbol system, a kind of meaning system that creates a certain kind of account of the world and of reality that infuses it with a sense of sacrality. So Geertz is more neutral. He's not saying he's not making a theological claim, but it's quasi-theological in the sense of it is about something more than the merely human. So we want to kind of understand that. What's the meaning system? What's the kind of interpretive framework that's being used to kind of understand reality? And of course, Taoism has its own unique symbol system. And then the 7 dimensions of religion via Ninian Smart. So Smart talks about practices, doctrines, narratives, experiences, ethics, social organization, and material culture. And we can use that to understand Taoism more broadly, but specifically classical Taoism. So we can say, does classical Taoism have specific practices? Well, we just saw that. There's an emphasis on Dao Shu. Doctrines, we've already kind of encountered that. Narratives, experiences, of course, right? Ethics, that's a little more debatable because of the way that classical Taoism looks at De, inner power or virtue, and has certain kind of critique of conventional morality. Social organization, so not institution, but was there a community there? Yes, there's clear evidence for an emerging Taoist community with, as I said, a kind of sense, its own sense of community. And then these emerging lineages, so a kind of sense of genealogy related to teachers and students, and then material culture. Well, the material culture evidence is right in front of us because we're reading texts. That is the material culture of classical Taoism. And there are many other dimensions as well. So if you read the text carefully, you find at least some references to dimensions of material culture. So for instance, in the Zhuangzi, there's references to mats, there's references to halls, there's even references to hermitages, and so on. So then thinking about this intellectual genealogy of classical Taoism is not what classical Taoists, quote unquote, used to refer to themselves. I was just showing you the indigenous terms. So this is a modern Western name for this earliest Taoist community. And we also talk about the inner cultivation lineages, which I'll show you in a moment. But there is a kind of minority view in Taoist studies. It's the dominant, I would say, not the dominant, the emerging revisionist view of Taoism. Okay, so it's still controversial. A lot of people reject it. But there is some kind of not just evidence for it, but at least some segment of the Taoist studies community, that is people who have dedicated their lives to teaching and researching Taoism, to think about something like classical Taoism. So Christopher Schipper, this Dutch scholar, he died recently. He didn't talk about classical Taoism, but in the Taoist Body and in this chapter that he contributed to Taoism, the Arts of China, Taoism, the Story of the Way, he talks about connective strands through the tradition. So he doesn't make this kind of clear distinction between something like classical Taoism and organized Taoism, or to use that outdated and inaccurate Orientalist construction of philosophical Taoism and religious Taoism. He's trying to think through how Taoism is really the story of the way, and the story of the way unfolds in all these different manners that have different kinds of connections that oftentimes are overlooked. But then this moves into Russell Kirkland, a scholar now retired at the University of Georgia. He wrote these two influential articles where he actually talks about classical Taoism. So he makes an argument against philosophical Taoism and religious Taoism and that kind of construct in multiple respects. So part of my work draws upon Kirkland to think about classical Taoism. And then Harold Roth, so Harold Roth of Brown University, one of the key scholars on developing this revisionist view of classical Taoism. In 1996, he wrote an article, or contributed a chapter, I should say, called The Inner Cultivation Tradition of Early Taoism. And then Original Tao, which is a book you might know, focusing on the Neya inward training. Contributed a chapter on Taoist apophatic meditation to a book that I edited, Contemplative Literature, and then more recently, The Contemplative Foundations of Classical Taoism. So that book then has been influenced by me, where he's saying, okay, now he's going to shift into classical Taoism. In his earlier work, he talked about things like proto-Taoism or Daoistic, and then into like early Taoism, but now this is becoming more, I guess, accepted and utilized, this idea of classical Taoism. And then into me, where in the Taoist tradition, I kind of put forth the framework that I showed you earlier, made a strong argument for classical Taoism into a lot of the more recent Taoist studies guides that I've done, and then more recently, the Tao Te Ching, a contextual, contemplative, and annotated bilingual translation, which was just published. And in that book, I take on the challenge of people rejecting classical Taoism, still clinging to philosophical Taoism, or even rejecting the idea that there was Taoism in the Warring States and early Han Dynasty altogether, and giving you a more robust kind of evidence and argument for the existence of classical Taoism, and not just from my perspective, using the actual textual materials to show that these Taoists were in fact Taoists, and they had this emerging sense of tradition. They were a self-conscious religious community. So thinking about the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism. So the inner cultivation lineages is a term coined by Harold Roth, who I mentioned before, but I think this is accurate, right? So this adds another layer to understanding classical Taoism. It's fine just to use classical Taoism, but there's a way to say, well, what defined classical Taoism as an emerging movement was something that we can legitimately refer to as the inner cultivation lineages. So you can reverse translate this. It doesn't exist, right, in the sources themselves. I showed you Dao Shu, the technique of the Dao. So one might say maybe those Taoists thought of themselves as Dao Shu Zhe, the technicians of the Dao. But in this case, using inner cultivation lineages, I think can be reverse translated, and we can think of this as Nei Xiu Dao or Nei Xiu Pai, the way of inner cultivation or internal cultivation, or even the lineage of inner cultivation. Probably Nei Xiu Dao is closer to what it was, because then that Dao here as the way of inner cultivation, points towards the possibility of a movement that falls into the category of classical Taoism. These were loosely affiliated master-disciple communities. Okay? They had a shared worldview, spiritual repertoire, and training regimen. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about that in a moment. As I said, they were religious from my perspective. Why were they religious? Because they had a specific soteriology, so a specific ultimate purpose that was union with the Tao, and specifically mystical union with the Tao, which also focused on the Tao as this kind of numinous presence in the world, in the body, that could be cultivated, that could be experienced, and also a specific theology, so a specific view of the sacred. And this, of course, centers on the Tao. Here, I would also say, and this challenges a lot of the philosophical constructions and appropriations of Taoism, and specifically classical Taoism, is that what they focused on is what we could characterize as a theologically infused contemplative practice. So it wasn't just meditation in an abstract sense or like about nothing. It was meditation specifically aimed at realizing the Tao. And from this classical Taoist perspective, one can realize and experience the Tao in this embodied, lived way. So the classical Taoist textual corpus is actually quite complex. This is largely influenced by the work of Harold Roth, but most people focus on 3 and 5. The Lao Tzu, the Book of Venerable Masters, usually mistranslated as the Book of Master Lao, or the Tao Te Ching, and the Zhuangzi, the Book of Master Zhuang. But in fact, there are other texts and layers of text or sections of text that need to be added. So the Guanzi, and specifically the so-called Xinshu, the techniques of the heart-mind chapters, and there are 4 of these, with the Neya being especially important, chapter 49 of the Received Guanzi Inward Training. Select chapters of the Huainanzi, so this is a bit complicated, right? Some people will say the Huainanzi is a Taoist text, and then there's a view that no, parts of it are Taoist or parts of it are Taoistic, but these are some of the kinds of key chapters. Also, select chapters from the Lu Shi Chuanqiu, the Spring and Autumn Annals of Master Lu. So one of the challenges we face is the way that these texts have been categorized historically, the way they're received as not being Taoist text or being Taoist text. And there's this question about the actual contextual relationship of them. How do they relate to each other? There's clear evidence, and again, this is in my new Tao Te Ching book, that in the Zhuangzi itself, the Zhuangzi is linking the Lao Tzu and the Guanzi, and specifically the Neya, together. So in the Zhuangzi itself, the later parts of the Zhuangzi, when you have this kind of more, I think, established kind of emerging tradition, they're associating these teachings and these texts with each other in this kind of sense that you could say is a classical Taoist textual corpus. So of course, the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism and the Taoist tradition more generally focuses on the Tao. So as I mentioned, the Tao is the sacred or ultimate concern of Taoists. If we look at this from an etymological perspective, the left side of the character is chuo, to move or to walk, and the right side is shou, head. So on the most basic level, it's kind of pointing towards a path that one walks, right? A human being on a path. So in its context, so a contemporaneous context, a lot of people were talking about the Tao, but when they used the Tao, they were talking about their own small Taos, their own ways, their specific paths. So there was a Ruist or a Confucian path, there was a legalist path, and so on. But one of the things that happens in classical Taoism is Taoists take this character, this term, and use it to designate what's ultimately real. From a classical and foundational Taoist perspective, the Tao has four primary characteristics: the source of everything, an unnameable mystery, an all-pervading sacred presence, and the universe as transformative process. So I'll just say a few things about this, right? Everything comes from the Tao. So ultimately, everything is a manifestation of the Tao. It's connected to the Tao in varying degrees. So Taoists tend to emphasize non-differentiation. So that's the kind of source as one. But there's a view of the cosmogony, the way the universe comes to be, is that it comes from emanation. So it moves from non-differentiation to differentiation. And all individual beings and things are actually manifesting the Tao in some degree or another. So of course that's complicated, right? To what extent are human beings manifesting the Tao? And so there's the kind of famous Taoist oral saying, right? Human beings may be distant from the Tao, but the Tao is never distant from human beings. But there is this sense of alignment and misalignment, or attunement and misattunement. An unnameable mystery. This is one of the places where people oftentimes get confused about Taoism. So we saw this with Xuan, mystery or darkness. Well, you just named it the Tao. Well, there's a phrase or sentence in the Tao Te Ching that feeds into the later Taoist tradition that says, compelled to name it, we call it Tao. So people need a name for what's ultimately real, but that name or that character or that designation is not what's ultimately real. So there's a strong emphasis in Taoism on this mystery, this namelessness, that it's beyond names, it's beyond concepts, it's beyond comprehension. So how do we cultivate this? And so there's an emphasis on open receptivity to allow the Tao and reality to unfold as it is in its immediacy to the extent that we can experience that as human beings. An all-pervading sacred presence. So I usually invoke Ling here in the sense of some kind of numinosity, but it also relates to Qi. So we tend not to translate Qi, but subtle breath, vital breath, energy, sometimes translated kind of somewhat confusingly as pneuma, this kind of Greek term, but that's a bit like translating as prana, right? So we don't need to use other foreign terms for a Chinese term, so we tend not to leave it as qi, qi. So the idea, or the view, I should say, in Taoism, the experience of Taoists of the Tao, is that it's energetic in nature. So there are many different types of qi. So Taoists, this is not necessarily in classical Taoism, but in the larger tradition, talk about Tao qi, the qi of the Tao, or Wei energy. So there's a less differentiated form of qi, a more primordial form of qi that is the Tao in its kind of purer form that we can cultivate, that we can connect with. And then the universe as transformative process. So this is not a substance-based ontology. That is, the universe is not primarily substance, it's primarily process. You might hear some kind of parallels with Buddhism or traditional Hindu cosmology, but slightly different here because the emphasis is on yin and yang and qi, and even into the 5 phases. So that's like slightly later than what we're talking about here, but roughly contemporaneous is when these views are emerging, but definitely yin and yang. So everything is transforming into everything else. And this is really important for understanding the Tao from a Taoist perspective. The Tao is manifesting as through the universe, the world, nature, human beings, other beings. So that includes the body. The body is generally seen as positive. So from a Taoist perspective, and especially a classical and foundational Taoist perspective, it is more of a world-affirming and body-affirming view. Okay? And so this is the Tao from a Taoist perspective. And then we can think about Daoism as the way to the way, and we're focusing more on the inner cultivation lineages of classical Daoism. So again, pulling out some evidence from the Zhuangzi, from the Book of Master Zhuang. So this is from chapter 4. So again, the earliest layer of the text, the inner chapters. And in chapter 4, it says, you will probably go and get yourself executed. That's all. The way doesn't want mixture. When mixed up, there's multiplicity. When multiplied, there is disturbance. And when disturbed, there is anxiety. Anxiety that has no relief. Utmost persons of ancient times first preserved it in themselves, and only then preserved it in others. When you have not stabilized it in yourself, how do you have time to consider what some tyrant is doing? So this is obviously a dialogue, thinking about potentially going and giving advice to a ruler. But for present purposes, you can see I've bolded Dao and the way. This can be interpreted in a number of ways. One way it can be interpreted is the Dao, D with an uppercase D, focusing on the Tao as the ultimate concern of Taoists. But there's also a way to read it in the way that I've translated it, as talking about Daoism as the way to the way. So Tao here as the way in the sense of the path that Taoists follow, the path that Taoists are emphasizing, focusing on this particular kind of meditation that I'm about to show you. So here it's talking about, are you following the way? Well, the way needs some kind of clarity. You have to be careful about confusion, adding other things that might distort the way as this path to the Tao. And so they invoke the persons of ancient times, and we saw this before with the way of the ancients, right? So we could say, right, Gu Zhi Ren, so the way of the utmost persons of ancient times. They are focusing first on preserving in themselves and only then preserved it in others. So it's focusing on inner cultivation, like we're seeing here, and less on both external expression, but also external advice. So the most important thing is internal cultivation and maintaining this path. And then you need stability of that, right? Before you can actually advise others. And then if you read the Zhuangzi carefully, it's quite complicated in terms of, should you even be giving political advice? Should you be involved in the larger society? So that's an intra-Taoist debate in this context. So you have examples of classical Taoist lineages. Okay, this again is from the Zhuangzi, and of course, this is somewhat controversial and debatable. Are these actual lineages? Are these fictitious lineages? Are they modeled on actual people and so on? For me, that's less relevant, right? What's more relevant is you see evidence of teachers and students in dialogic exchange and doing certain kinds of training, okay? And then this sense that there really is a genealogy, there is a lineage, there is some kind of spiritual ancestry. So there is a self-conscious community, an emerging sense of tradition here. So this again is from the Zhuangzi, chapter 23. The understanding of people of antiquity went a long way. How far did it go? To the point where some believe that things have never existed. So far to the end where nothing can be added. Those at the next stage thought that things exist. They looked upon life as loss, upon death as a return. Thus they had already entered the state of dividedness. Those at the next stage said, in the beginning there was non-being, later there was life, and when there was life, suddenly there was death. We look upon non-being as the head, on life as the body, on death as the rump. Who knows that being and non-being, life and death, are a unified watch? I will be their friend. These three groups, while different, belong to the same royal clan, though, as in the case of the Zhao and Jing families, whose names indicate their line of succession, and that of the Chu family, whose name derives from its fief, they are not identical. So when we look at this, there is a discussion about Daoism, right? An emerging sense of Daoism as having a particular set of beliefs and views, and that there's a family here, right? So they're defining it as a royal clan, families, lines of succession, and so on, even potentially these fiefs where it's a kind of land designation. And if you read the Zhuangzi carefully, there's a fair amount about geographical location and proximity an exchange between people from different areas and so on, and I mean on a spiritual level. So when we start to analyze this, we see that this is Taoists defining themselves in a particular way, specifically through the language of families. And again, if you're kind of following this larger discussion, that invokes Daojia. So they're not saying Daojia, but there's a kind of quasi-invocation of what will later be referred to as Daojia, the family of the Tao. So if we continue on in chapter 5 of the Zhuangzi, there's this other exchange. Shentu Jia, extended disciple excelling who had lost a foot, was studying with Bo Huan Wu Ren, elder obscurity beyond humanity, along with Zi Chan, Adept Chan of Zheng. Zi Chan addressed Shentu Jia. If I go out first, you wait. If you go out first, I'll wait. The next day, the two of them were sitting together on the same mat, Xi, in the hall, Tang. Zi Chan said to Shentu Jia, if I go out first, you wait. If you go out first, I'll wait. Now I will go out. Are you going to wait or aren't you? When you see a prime minister, you don't even get out of the way. Do you think you're equal to a prime minister? Shentu Jia said, within the gates, Mun, of the master, is there any such thing as prime minister? You delight in being a prime minister and pushing people behind you. But as I've heard, if the mirror is bright, dust does not settle. If dust settles, it isn't bright. When you live around worthy people for a long time, you'll be free of faults. Today you regard the master as great, and yet you talk like this. It isn't right, is it? So there are a lot of really interesting parts of this passage, especially for our purposes of thinking about the existence of the inner cultivation lineages of classical Daoism. So the first thing is there's a master, right? Bo Huan Wu Ren, who's not there, but his disciples are talking about him and his teachings. So Shentu Jia and Zi Chan are having this conversation. So there's dialogic exchange based upon their training, based upon previous teachings. And when we look at this, here we find what I referenced before about the material culture and maybe even infrastructure. They're sitting on the same mat in the hall. So the hall of the master and having this conversation. And Zi Chan is basically talking about some kind of social hierarchy, especially bringing in outside social identity and position inside the hall, inside the Taoist community. And Shentu Jia, who presumably is supposed to be inferior because he's lost a foot, right? So presumably he's something like a criminal, right? The state has amputated his foot for some reason, says, within the gates of the master, is there any such thing as prime minister? You delight in being a prime minister and pushing people behind you. But as I've heard, if the mirror is bright, dust does not settle. If dust settles, it isn't bright. When you live around worthy people for a long time, you'll be free of faults. Today, you regard the master as great, and yet you talk like this. It isn't right, is it? So Shentu Jia now is invoking the teachings of Bo Huan Wu Ren to say to Zi Chan, have you really learned and studied with the master, with the teacher? Because it doesn't seem like you fully understand the teachings and the practice. And then here it's interesting because now they're using the language of gates, which becomes really central in the later tradition. We saw earlier about Xuanmen, the mysterious gate, as Taoism. So here you have another invocation of gates. But here it's interesting to think about it, right? There's a geographical proximity or demarcation. So if you're outside the gates, you can keep your social identity. If you come inside the gates, inside of Taoism, you have to leave your ordinary social identity, do Taoist practice in this committed way where you're thinking about your Taoist practice and your Taoist identity as primary and following the teachings of this particular master. And then here we have something that people oftentimes assume is a Chan or Zen Buddhist metaphor, the mind mirror or the mirror mind, but this is already in the inner chapters of the Zhuangzi. And you can then think they're being trained in meditation, right? Your mind is the mirror. So through meditation, the mirror is becoming bright and dust does not settle. So if there's dust, if there's some kind of impurity, if there's some kind of obscuration, it isn't bright. And this is what you learn, this is what you realize through the practice, and you become faultless. And there you can find parallels of this in the Tao Te Ching. So now you have the application of the teachings through a kind of lived experiential perspective, and then that kind of conversation. So a lot of layers here to point towards the possibility of self-conscious Taoist community in this period. And then, as I mentioned, the reference to the gates. So in the later Taoist tradition, there's this invocation of Ruman, literally entering the gates, as becoming a Taoist. So becoming initiated or becoming ordained, talking about this as Ruman. You enter the gates, you become part of the Taoist tradition. And also the designation of Taoist, and specifically initiated or ordained Taoist members of a particular lineage under a particular teacher, as Munren, literally gate people. So people who have entered the gates, people who are inside the gates, and you already find that in classical Taoism. So this idea of where are you located in relationship to Taoism? Have you entered the gates of Taoism? And if so, there's certain values and certain practices. Are you outside of the gates of Taoism talking about Taoism or talking about Taoist? And as I mentioned then, also Xuanmen, the mysterious gate, this allusion to Tao Te Ching chapter 1, but that becomes used in the later Taoist tradition as a name for Taoism, the mysterious gate. And one thing that's interesting about this is not just that Taoism is the gateway to the mysterious, but that it's possible to think about the fact that the Tao itself has this, that they're portals into the Tao. They're invisible, they're numinous. So how do we find them? And one Taoist response to this would be through practice, through a particular kind of practice. So there are a lot of technical terms that are largely overlooked related to what we talk about as classical Taoist apophatic and quietistic meditation. That is emptiness and stillness-based meditation. So Bao Yi, embracing the one, Gui Gun, returning to the root, Shou Jing, guarding stillness, Shou Yi, guarding the one, Shou Zhong, guarding the center, Xin Jai, the fasting of the heart mind, Zuo Wang, sitting in forgetfulness. So these come from different Taoist texts. Some of them come from the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power. Some of them come from the Zhuangs of the Book of Master Zhuang. Some of them are found in the Neya, inward training, and so on. So one of the things we want to be thinking about is when we invoke this Western category of meditation, what kind of meditation are we talking about? What are the indigenous names? So Shou Yi is the one that a lot of people know about, guarding the one, that becomes used in the later tradition as an umbrella category for meditation. But in classical Taoism, it's specifically talking about apophatic and quietistic meditation. So Bao Yi, embracing the one. So you can see this. Bao Yi is parallel to Shou Yi, right? Guarding the one, embracing the one. So the one, the Tao as the one, the Tao as primordial oneness, as primordial unity. So you're engaged in a certain kind of practice where you embrace and you guard that oneness, that state of unity with the Tao. Gui Gun, right, returning to the root. So in Tao Te Ching chapter 16, Gui Gun is defined as Jing, as stillness. So you return to the root, you cultivate stillness, and then this is the means to realize your Ming, your life destiny. This is what the Tao Te Ching says. So returning to the root is returning to the ground of our being. In the context of the Tao Te Ching, that's Ming, that's life destiny, sometimes translated as fate. But we can also think about this as Xing, as innate nature. That's in the Neya, in inward training, but also in the Zhuangzi, throughout the Zhuangzi, actually. Shou Jing, guarding stillness. So again, we have the Shou character. So Shou, the verb to guard, is one of the main verbs to designate meditation in classical Taoism. So guarding stillness, that's straightforward. Guarding the center, so Shou Zhong. The center here usually designates the heart, but it can also refer to the navel region as the primary storehouse of qi in the body. Also, Xin Jai from Zhuangzi chapter 4 and Zuo Wang, sitting in forgetfulness, from Zhuangzi chapter 6. So these are connected. Fasting of the heart mind. So withholding ordinary nourishment from the ordinary heart mind, that is the things that agitate the heart mind. so that the pure heart mind emerges. So in a later Taoist sense, this relates to original spirit. So as we do this kind of fasting, as we withhold this kind of ordinary sense perception and psychological reactivity, the heart mind becomes pure, and then there's this clarity of consciousness that emerges, feeding into 坐忘, sitting in forgetfulness. So sometimes this is mistranslated as sitting in oblivion. Wang literally means something like to forget or forgetting. So seated forgetting or forgetful sitting. I prefer sitting in forgetfulness. So one of the reasons to translate Wang as forgetfulness is to draw parallels to Shu as emptiness and also Jing as stillness, right? Emptiness, stillness, forgetfulness. So these are parallel contemplative states. So all of these are indigenous names, classical Taoist names for what we refer to in English as apophatic and quietistic meditation. And all of the names are helpful for thinking about the practice. So when we look at this, then Wu Wei, so we're moving from left to right, top to bottom. So Wu Wei, Xiao Yao, and Qi Wu. So Wu Wei, non-action, Xiao Yao, carefree or being carefree, carefree wandering. Xiao Yao Yo is the title of chapter 1 of the Zhuangzi. So here I just have Xiao Yao, so being carefree, and Qi Wu, so making things equal. And one of the reasons to put these together is these are related principles, I would say, connected to apophatic meditation and specifically going through a process of deconditioning. Okay. So how do you practice apophatic and quietistic meditation from a classical Taoist perspective? Through effortlessness, right? So you stop reacting, you stop doing extra things, you just allow things to be, and gradually thoughts and emotions dissipate. So this can be connected to the second phrase, Xiao Yao, so being carefree, just allowing it to be what it is. And both of those characters, like we saw with Dao, contain the 12th radical, so the move or walk radical. So it has this idea of freedom of movement. And Qi Wu is the title of chapter 2 of the Zhuangzi, so making things equal. So just letting things be, letting things unfold, and specifically not privileging one thing over another. So one thing that people encounter in when they start this kind of Taoist meditation is wanting stillness and not wanting agitation, but that creates more agitation. So making things equal is saying the agitation is fine. And by doing that, by making space to include that over time, the agitation decreases and the stillness increases. So this is a particular kind of contemplative methodology. A lot of times these phrases are pulled out, again, going back to the earlier part of the talk, to be something like philosophical ideas. They're not ideas. They're principles, they're views, they're practices, and they're rooted in apophatic and quietistic meditation. So specifically Wu Wei, one of the Taoist kinds of views that's or principles that's extracted out of a larger Taoist worldview and approach and emphasized a lot in the modern world, it's focusing on, it's basically informing and informed by apophatic meditation, rooted in deconditioning. So if we look at some of the specific passages on heart fasting and seated forgetting, so Xin Jai and Zuo Wang from the Zhuangzi, as I mentioned, chapter 4 of the Zhuangzi. Yan Hui said, may I dare to ask about this method? Okay, so Fang here, not Shu, but still a method. Zhongni, Kongzi, Master Kong, that is Confucius, quote unquote, responded, you must fast. I will tell you what that means. Do you think that it is easy to do anything while you have a heart mind? If you do, the luminous heavens will not support you. Unify your aspirations. Don't listen with your ears, listen with your heart mind. No, don't listen with your heart mind, listen with qi. Listening stops with the ears, the heart mind stops with joining, but qi is empty and waits on all things. The Tao gathers in emptiness alone. Emptiness, shu, is the fasting of the heart mind, xin jai. Yan Hui said, before I heard this, I was certain that I was Hui, but now that I've heard it, there is no more Hui. Can this be called emptiness? Kongzi replied, that's all there is to it. It is easy to keep from walking. The hard thing is to walk without touching the ground. It is easy to cheat when you work for humanity. but hard to cheat when you work for the heavens. You have heard of flying with wings, but you have never heard of flying without wings. You have heard of the knowledge that knows, but you have never heard of the knowledge that does not know. Look into that watchtower, the empty room where brightness is born. Fortune and blessing gather in suspended cessation. But if you do not stop, this is what is called sitting but galloping. Allow your ears and eyes to pervade the inside and put mind and knowledge on the outside. Then even ghosts and spirits will come to dwell, not to mention human beings. This is the transformation of the 10,000 things. So there are a lot of layers in this. What I want to emphasize here is their actual instructions on how to do the practice, right? So unify your aspirations. So become concentrated, set your intent. Don't listen with your ears. So basically disengage sense perception. Listen with your heart mind. No, don't listen with your heart mind, listen with qi. So if we invoke the Tao Te Ching, empty the heart mind and fill the belly. So sink the qi into the navel region. Why? Listening stops with the ears. The heart mind stops with joining. So the ordinary heart mind is constantly joining with things, becoming agitated. But qi is empty and waits on all things. And this is really important. It gives you a definition of Xin Jai. Emptiness, Shu, is the fasting of the heart mind. So do you want to know if you've actually realized the condition or the state associated with this practice? You will be in a state of emptiness. That is the fasting of the heart mind, or heart fasting. And then the next part is interesting too, because Hui says, oh, I stopped being me. I stopped having separate identity, individual personhood. Is that what emptiness is? And Kongzi, in this imaginary dialogue, says, that's all there is. But then he kind of clarifies it. And what he says is, you have to focus on what I've translated as suspended cessation. So literally, stopping. Right? That's literally what it means. So if you're thinking about kind of larger Taoist views, maybe twofold stopping or twofold cessation. And then he gives you a definition. So we have zuo chi, sitting in, but galloping. So if you don't do that, you're meditating, but your mind is racing around. It's no coincidence that the later Taoist tradition talks about the mind as this kind of horse galloping around. So then focus on pervading the inside and put mind and knowledge on the outside. And there's a definition here about knowledge. So you find this in the Tao Te Ching too, of an oscillation back and forth between ordinary knowing, which limits you, the possibility of wuzhi, non-knowing, but maybe that as being gnosis, knowledge about ultimate things, an understanding or insight beyond ordinary understanding. And then when you look at the text, so one of the things I like to do is think about this as a kind of contemplative journey or a contemplative unfolding. So when you read about the fasting of the heart mind, then when you get to move towards sitting in forgetfulness, you actually encounter all these other characters in the text. So reading from that passage in chapter 4 into the upcoming passage in chapter 6, you encounter these other exchanges, including the one I showed you between Bo Huan Wu Ren and Shen Tu Jia, and those teachings and other kinds of teachings. So one way we can think about this is that person, Yan Hui, is continuing to practice, but also in having these other kinds of experiences, getting other kinds of insights, other kinds of teachings. And then we get to the passage in chapter 6 on Zuo Wang. And it says, Yan Hui said, so it's a continuation of that previous dialogue. I'm improving. I can sit and forget. I smash up my limbs and body, drive out perception and intellect, cast off form, do away with understanding, and make myself identical with great pervasion. Da Tong. This is what I mean by sitting in forgetfulness. Zuo Wang. Zhong Ni, so Confucius quote unquote said, if you're identical with it, you must have no preferences. If you've been transformed, you must have no more constancy. So you really are a worthy person after all. With your permission, I'd like to become your follower. So again, we have instructions and more details about how to do the practice, emphasizing sensory disengagement, decreasing psychological agitation, moving into a state of stillness until we get to identification or unification, sameness with great pervasion. So that's a contemplative state, moving into this union with the Tao. And then another definition. This is what I mean by Zuowang. What is Zuowang? Zuowang is becoming identical with Da Tong, with great pervasion. So to what extent have we merged with the Tao? That is the extent to which we're doing Zuowang, sitting in forgetfulness practice, or seated forgetting. And then another clarification. So have you become identical with it? Well, if so, then you don't have preferences. So this is one of the ways you know how deep have you gone into the practice and how much is it manifesting in your daily life? To what extent do you still analyze the world and your experience through preferences? If you've been transformed, you must have no more constancy. So Wu Chang, the use of Chang is complicated in classical Taoism. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's more of something you're overcoming. But here what they're really talking about is merging into formlessness, into non-differentiation. And so basically unifying with that energetic field of the Tao. If you've done that, then you're kind of realized, and now something unexpected happens. The teacher asked to become the student. So this is a kind of Taoist subversion of the kind of assumed relationship between Zhongni, Kongzi, and Yan Hui. The teacher becomes the student because the student has excelled the teacher on the practice. So a few last things I wanted to just show you is there's also some interesting intra-Taoist debates and discussion. And one of the things you find in classical Taoism is there are discussions of Jing, Qi, and Shen. So in the later tradition, this is referred to as the internal three treasures, the Ne Sanbao. So Jing, Qi, and Shen, vital essence, Qi, and spirit. Not necessarily with the same differentiation as in the later tradition, so with different meanings. But you find an emphasis on the vital substances in classical Taoism in the Inner Cultivation Lineages, focusing on conservation, replenishment, and integration, the possibility of cultivating these aspects of ourselves, these faculties, strengthening them, making them more manifest, including different views about Jing. So this is significant not just for Taoism, but for Chinese medicine, because what is Jing? What is vital essence? And in the Neye, you find a very distinctive and important kind of view of Jing. So this is chapter 8 of the Neye of inward training. If you can be aligned and still, only then can you become settled. With a stabilized heart-mind at the center, the ears and eyes acute and bright, the four limbs firm and stable, you can make a lodging place for vital essence. Vital essence is the essence of qi. So we have another definition. Jingzhe, qizhi jingye. So you can also translate this as vital essence is the concentration of qi. Okay? So it's a little strange because the definition they use repeats Jing, the character vital essence. But this is interesting because from my perspective in this text, what they're talking about is the replenishment of Jing, which is an uncommon view. So it's an intra-Taoist debate, an alternative view in the classical period, but especially when you move in a later period, this would be a minority view, almost non-existent, which is even though people assume vital essence, your foundational vitality is limited, will dissipate over time, it's possible to reconcentrate qi and make it, turn it back into vital essence. So you can replenish vital essence according to the Neye. But when we look at Jing in a comparative contemporaneous perspective, there are these other views. So XSS is Xinqiu Shang, so techniques of the heart mind one. It talks about vital essence becomes concentrated through stillness and solitary meditation. So this is a very important character from my perspective, a topic for another day, Du as solitary meditation. Then it becomes illumination, Ming, and spirit, Shen. SW is Su1, so the Huangdi Neijing Su1, the Yellow Thearch's Inner Classic Basic Question, Chapter 2, says, vital essence becomes exhausted in women at 7 times 7, so at 49, and in men at 8 times 8 at 64. So this becomes the kind of normative, dominant, traditional Chinese view that over time vital essence becomes dissipated, eventually exhausted. So of course this is somewhat problematic to say it's exhausted at 49 and 64 because you're still alive. So you must still have vital essence. But what they're talking about specifically is procreation, right? The ability to actually have children in men and women. And then of course, whether or not this is the case is open, but the idea is that it dissipates over time and eventually becomes exhausted. And then Huainanzi, the book of the Huainan Masters, chapter 7, is titled Jing Shen, which you could translate as concentrated divinity or quintessential spirit. But both of these characters, Jing, vital essence, and Shen, spirit, being combined here in a specific phrase. So one of the reasons to show you this is there's a lot of interesting materials on human personhood, but also claims about what practice does. So one view is that, dissipation, exhaustion is inevitable. So you have to do a kind of stronger conservation approach. Another is, yes, that's true, but it's also possible to replenish Jing, to replenish vital essence. And this you find especially in the Nei and inward training. And so these have radical consequences for our practice, but they also show that they're insights that come to Taoist practice from the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism. So, Tzu Bei, thanks for listening. Take care.